Welcome back to ISSR in Conversation here on the ISSR YouTube channel and major podcast services. As always, I am Anthony K. Nairn, ISSR Executive Assistant. This is the second part of the four-part series on ISSR's recently completed grant, generously funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, titled Understanding Spiritual Intelligence, or SI for short. This four-part series, which was recorded on Zoom between 28 June and 10 July 2023, follows in the wake of the 2023 ISSR Summer Conference on Spiritual and Artificial Intelligence. The speakers in this series, all presenters at the conference, were critical in bringing together the research and deliverables for this grant project. This second part, presented live on Zoom on 03 July 2023, titled Spiritual Conversations with Companion Machines, begins with the ISSR Executive Secretary Fraser providing a detailed overview of the late Yorick Wilks' work on the project on spiritual companions. Wilks, a computer scientist, unfortunately died late in the project, but was a central figure in the grant. Then, the methodology of the project is provided by Roberta Catazon, who explains how the Wizard of Oz method using ChatGPT-3 was implemented into a study using participants and a virtual spiritual companion. The results of this study are detailed by Fraser in his discussion on the empirical data of spiritual conversations with the machines developed by Wilks and Catazon. Then, a linguistic analysis of the participant research is provided by Gregory Greffenstedt, and then to lead the open discussion period, William Clarkson opens the floor, leading the discussion. Please enjoy the second episode of the special four-part series of ISSR's in Conversation on the topic of spiritual intelligence.
It's good to welcome you to this session, the second of a series of 4 Zoom sessions about this project. And today we're talking about research, which is really the research of Yorick Wilks. And as he's no longer with us, this research is being presented by friends and colleagues who'll be talking about different aspects of it. And to start things off, I'm going to talk about the kind of vision that Yorick had for building a spiritual companion, an automated spiritual companion. Other people may know more about this, may add more things later, but I'll give my understanding of this. It arose out of work that Yorick had done earlier on in developing a personalized companion for the elderly, and work that was funded, I think, by the EU. And the idea was that an automated companion would get to know its owner really well. So it would be a repository for the owner's memories and opinions and attitudes. In time, it would develop a very complex model of its owner. In principle, it might come to know everything about its owner. So it would embody within it, the automated companion would embody all available information about a single life. And ethically, Yorick's hope with this would have an overriding duty of loyalty and confidentiality towards its owner. I think in practice that might have been difficult to implement because of manufacturers' constraints, but that was the ideal and the hope, that it would be know everything it needed to know about its owner, and it would have a duty of service and loyalty to its owner. So then when we started talking about this, project on understanding spiritual intelligence, and I should have said earlier on that this work we're talking about today is part of a project on understanding spiritual intelligence that was funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation as part of their Diverse Intelligences initiative. When we started talking about this, Yorick hoped that he could transfer from his previous work on companions for the elderly to this project on spiritual intelligence and built an automated spiritual companion. which he thought might operate in various different modes. It might be relatively non-directive sometimes, facilitating self-exploration. And there was some, as some of you will know, some early work going back to the 1960s from Weizenbaum, programming non-directive counseling. So that seemed fairly straightforward. Or it might offer explanations of why things had happened as they did. It might offer spiritual advice in the way that a spiritual director might. And people might use this in different ways. Some, if it was embodied in a phone, it would be available at all times. Some people might choose to have very frequent contact with it. But Yorick was also aware that there is a balance in the spiritual life between silence and conversation. And so he anticipated that some people might want to be quite boundaried in their use of their automated spiritual companion rather than being in constant dialogue with it. And it would be used in different moods in different ways. Will be used in times of spiritual desolation, also in times of joy. It could receive and respond to expressions of guilt and remorse. It could help people explore the meaning and significance of experiences that they'd had. It could help them to explore issues of faith and doubt. So it could be used for a variety of purposes, and it's possible to, Yorick thought, to develop a spiritual companion in different modes. It might be sort of primarily a confessor, it might be primarily an explainer, or it might perhaps be versatile and be able to move between those different moods. So that was the sort of big vision of where ultimately this work on the spiritual companion might go. But the work we were actually able to do in the limitations of this project, we always knew would be much more limited than that. And we started out with some Wizard of Oz research, where people believed they were interacting with a computer, but actually interacting with a wizard, a human being who was masquerading behind a computer interface. And that enabled us to test the acceptability to people of talking about spiritual things with what they believed to be a computer. Of course, they were debriefed afterwards. We thought that the people would not mind once it was explained to them that they had been talking to a human being all along. And in fact, as we had expected, they were all perfectly happy about that. Later on, we had intended to use expert systems to develop a computer that would provide its own responses. But in fact, in the course of the research, GPT-3 came along and we switched horses and decided to go with that. Just to say something about the available methodologies for doing programming or enabling a computer to generate responses in spiritual conversation. There are basic chatbot methodologies, and that's the one that was used for Weizenbaum's program on non-directive counseling. So, for example, if the user mentions the word mother, the computer could just pick up that verbal cue and respond to it with something like, "Tell me more about your family." That's a very straightforward kind of methodology. It's also possible to use expert knowledge or dialogue theory and to build that into the programming of the computer. So you take the kind of conversations that people have with human spiritual directors. You would work from those actual conversations back to the scripts that people implicitly seem to be following in those conversations and systematize those into a pre-formal pseudocode that could then be programmed. And my understanding of the work on automated companions for the elderly used a hybrid of that kind of dialogue theory and the chatbot methodology. Roberta knows more about that than I do. That's my understanding. Also now, there is an increasing possibility of machine learning, and that's what GPT-3 uses, of course. In the future, it might be possible to develop some kind of hybrid between machine learning and these other earlier methodologies, but that might be quite complicated and not something that we attempted in this research. So I've explained something about Yorick's long-term vision of where we might be going, and what we actually did in our research with first some Wizard of Oz research and then later some GPT research. And at this point, perhaps I can hand over to Roberta to say something about what actually happened.
Sure. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Yep. So I'm going to talk about the methodology that Fraser was just talking about. Okay. So what we did is we built a system, and I'm calling it the Spiritual Intelligence Companion, because as Fraser said, this comes out of work for what we call the Senior Companion that was part of an EU project. So the overview of the Spiritual Intelligence Companion, the goal was to build a computer dialogue system to talk about religion and spirituality, and get feedback from users about what they thought of the system. Would they be interested in ever using such a system? I mean, we thought this was going to be the best way to try to answer that question. So we chose to use a human type avatar, and we chose somebody from the project, which you'll see in a minute, with speech output. We created two different systems, termed phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 was run over Zoom sessions with a human avatar disguised as a computer avatar, as Fraser mentioned, and that's what we told them at the beginning of the project. At the end, we revealed that it was actually a person, not a computer avatar. And phase 2 was a system we built using the most advanced OpenAI dialogue model, which isn't actually GPT-3 or 4, but it's along the lines of GPT-3, I would say. It has an API, etc. And we recruited users for both systems, and we saved all of the dialogue data in both phases, which were then passed on to Greg for language analysis. Let me just try and close that down. And you'll hear more about that in a minute. So let's see, where do we? Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. So phase 1, as I said, it ran over Zoom, and this was during lockdown, some of this, so that was quite handy, where a human was disguised as a computer avatar. And the people that were being disguised were some of the people on the project, actually, some of them theologians, etc. You're probably all familiar with the Wizard of Oz technique, but you basically, there's an element of deceit. People think they're talking to a machine, and when really they're talking to a human. So for phase one, we ran 22 sessions. We had 6 users. The users were Catholics. They were aged between 30 and 70 years old. And they were recruited through an advertisement in the tablet newsletter. They all did 4 40-minute sessions, and that gave us the total of 22 sessions. Why did we use the Wizard of Oz session? It really was to enable us to start right at the beginning of the project, before any dialogue system could be built, or modified or amended. All the sessions were recorded and transcribed and used as input to Greg's linguistic analysis algorithm, which you're going to hear about. Users believed they were talking to an avatar, not a real person. Users were told at the end that they had been talking to a real person, asked to complete a questionnaire. And overall, the users enjoyed their sessions and were sorry that they were ending. In the phase 2 system, which used the most advanced OpenAI dialogue system, it looks exactly like the phase 1 system, and I'm going to show you that in a minute, the look and feel. But it has, this is the fully computerized system now. So the reason for using OpenAI advanced models, well, everybody probably knows by now, because it's in the news all the time, the ability to talk about a broad range of topics, including religion and spirituality. But the conversational ability of the OpenAI dialogue models is very impressive. They can talk about pretty much anything, and they were far ahead of a system we could build in some months. So it seemed an obvious choice. We weren't trying to build the best dialogue system possible in this project. That wasn't really the goal, but rather to try to understand if there's a place for computer dialogue about topics of religion and spirituality. So that's what we were trying to assess. 31 sessions were collected with 27 users. Some did more than one, ranging in age from 30 to 90, and the religious beliefs were unknown of these people. They were recruited from Facebook. A message was posted saying what the project was and asked for volunteers, and people decided to do it. We controlled the number of users because there's a cost associated with each user session using any of the OpenAI models, where the more developed models are more costly. And we did use the most advanced one. So although the cost in the end wasn't significant, I mean, it was for all that we did, including all of the testing, there were many sessions there. It was $150. So really, but had we put it on a sort of bulletin board or something on the internet, we could have had thousands, and then it would have actually been costly. So no deception was used in this phase, and users were asked to complete a questionnaire at the end of their session. This is the architecture of the system. The user opens a Chrome browser and logs in. We sent logins and passwords. And the way it works is, you see this picture, I'll show you a larger version of that in a second. The users type the text in, and the avatar speaks back to them. And below the typed user text is a full dialogue history of what's been said so far. So the user input is passed on to the spiritual intelligence system that we created, which was a matter of putting pieces together, really. And what those pieces were, it opens a connection to OpenAI, it does some text processing on the input, and it adds to the conversation at the very beginning an OpenAI dialogue prompt, which really describes the kind of personality of the avatar. And I'll show you what we used in a second. And there's management of the dialogue context as well, because it isn't just the one single user utterance that we're passing on, but we're passing on a subset of the dialogue, 20 utterances. So there's a kind of framework. And that gets, so that's out. The output of that particular box is system is processed user input text. And that goes to OpenAI, which uses the best model at the time, which is Text DaVinci 03. There might be a 04 now, but that was the best one when we used it. And it returns a response. That response goes back into our system where it's added to the dialogue context, so we know the full context. And that text is saved as well. The output of that part is a wizard response, which then goes to a module that manages the avatar, which is done by a third-party system called SitePal, and a text-to-speech service. So the wizard response is output via text to speech, via speech, and the avatar's expressions and movement are aligned with that. And so that's how the architecture for the phase 2 system works. Okay, as I said, one of the key things when you're building a system like this with OpenAI is to create the personality of the avatar. And you do that through a prompt. So this is what the prompt told OpenAI, that the wizard is an AI assistant who likes to discuss and answer questions about religion, theology, and spirituality from the user. The wizard is helpful, kind, creative, clever, very friendly, and has an enormous amount of knowledge about religion, theology, and spirituality. The wizard can counsel the user about death and dying, as well as how to reach spiritual fulfillment. The wizard takes particular interest in discussing the following human values: feeling, wonder, community, time, truth, change, leadership, heaven, family, humanity, hope, soul, listening, and meaning. The wizard admits to being an AI creation, and the wizard does not repeat himself and tries not to say contradictory things. This is a closer picture of the avatar, and you may see this is one of our project members, Marius, handsome, and the Da Vinci Last Supper behind. So you can see here, the bottom bit shows the dialogue history, and here's the text box for the user to type into. Okay, general findings and personal observations, really. In phase 1, people generally like talking to the phase 1 system. And they said they were going to miss the sessions, and they really sounded genuine, actually. This, when they were over, this surprised me, is there were holdups with network connectivity, and things, Zoom problems. But despite all that, it appealed to them. So it may be that speaking of one's feelings and beliefs can be a great way to understand what one thinks. That's more or less what some of them said. And one thing that was noted was that because they did 4 sessions each person did 4 sessions, they referred back to previous conversations. So that suggests that a dialogue history over multiple sessions, would be essential in a real world system. I mean, we were doing it for one particular session, but it would have to cross multiple sessions, I think, to be really useful. Phase 2, the users who used the phase 2 system, they had mixed feelings. Some liked the system quite a lot. Others hated it and expected more. Some users even tried to trick the system into contradictions, which seemed a bit pointless. But anyway, this would suggest that a study of the expectations of users could be very useful in the building of the next system. I mean, clearly we have a long way to go, but the dialogue technology is moving much faster than it was when we started. And so it really is encouraging, I think. You know, future research, how to make it better. We need more users, obviously, because of the cost, you know, and the research project. I mean, we didn't, you know, we weren't able, but, you know, in the future, maybe there would be funding for that. Different interfaces. It would be good to compare user reactions to, you know, companion systems that use different kinds of interfaces. They could be, some could be non-human. One person said, why wasn't there a woman rather than a man, the avatar? And this could also include using typing with no visual interface. Anyway, lots of work could be done here. The avatar personality. Okay, you saw the prompt that we used. We tried to make it kind and, you know, forget. But in this project, some of the surveys and comments suggest that the users really wanted an avatar to drive the conversation and maybe even argue points. So there may be some interest in, you know, an avatar that brings up contentious topics and argues about them. There is a possibility for model training. You can train the language model to customize conversational topics, views, and beliefs. It seems straightforward, but it really isn't due to possible conflict with OpenAI models' general knowledge. We tried to do a bit of this. I did a bit of this, but experienced interference with the general knowledge. So more work could definitely be done there. And here's a phase 1 snippet, user enjoyment. If I may, I can just go here and play you this. Can you hear this?
Hello.
Can you hear that? Can anyone hear that sound?
Yes.
Okay.
How are you today?
I am fine, thank you. I wonder how you are.
Oh, I'm okay too, thank you. I'm sad in a way this is going to be our last session because I've enjoyed it. It's been a very interesting experience and I wonder where it will lead, you know. But there we go. Everything in life comes to an end at some point, doesn't it?
That's true. But do say what you have found enjoyable.
Oh, I think what's been interesting for me are the questions often that you have posed. After I've finished speaking, I'm never sure which aspect of what I've said you're going to pick up on. And often the questions make me think very carefully about my responses and why I've said what I've said and the deeper meaning of things, you know. So I think it's good, isn't it? It's good to be challenged as to why you say things and why you believe things.
Okay, so that came from phase 1, and you know, you notice there were little pauses, a little slow to come back, but that's due to, you know, the fact that it's all running over Zoom and things like that. And lastly, I have just a snippet from the phase 2, which I'll play. And that'll be the end of my presentation. So here it is. Oh.
User enlightenment. Wizard enlightenment is the process of attaining spiritual understanding through inner transformation. It is a journey towards greater self-awareness and understanding of the universe, and ultimately, the achievement of personal liberation from suffering. Enlightenment can be thought of as an awakening to the truth of existence and is often associated with feelings of peace, joy, and bliss. User, how can one achieve enlightenment? Wizard, enlightenment is a personal journey, and there is no one-size-fits-all answer. Generally speaking, it involves cultivating inner stillness and awareness of the present moment, while letting go of attachment to material possessions, thoughts, and emotions. Self-inquiry, meditation, and mindfulness practices can help one to cultivate this awareness. User, who has achieved enlightenment in your opinion? Wizard, there are many people throughout history who have achieved enlightenment, including the Buddha, Jesus, Lao Tzu, and other spiritual leaders of various faiths. It is impossible to definitively say who has achieved enlightenment since it is such a personal experience. User, what were the Buddha's last words? Wizard, the Buddha's last words, according to Buddhist tradition, were, "All composite things are perishable. Strive for your own liberation with diligence." This is often interpreted as a call to remain focused on achieving enlightenment and freedom from suffering.
That's all. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Roberta.
Welcome.
So it's back to me now for the next stage. I'm going to see if I can share screen here. So this is intended to be empirical research on spiritual conversation with a computer. And we've got two kinds of data. There's linguistic data that Greg will present in a moment, but I'm going to present some questionnaire data now. And just to recall that this is a project of Yorick Wilks, and there's a picture of Yorick to remind us of him. Leading figure in AI, and a few years ago he published this book, Artificial Intelligence, Modern Magic or Dangerous Future. He was also a larger-than-life personality and a brilliant intellectual. And as I say, it's we wouldn't be talking about this research today if it wasn't for Yorick. So I'll talk first about the Wizard questionnaire data. We developed a questionnaire for experience of interaction with the system, the same questionnaire for Wizard research as for the GPT-3. As Roberta said, there were 6 users here. They were all religious and church-going and Catholic. They were recruited by advertisement, and they had 4 sessions each. In the questionnaire, there were 3 things that they were asked to rate on a 10-point scale. The other questions were yes or no. One was level of interest, how interested they were. And they were interested. I think that's come through from what Roberta's already said, an average of 6.3 over these 6 people. Benefit a little bit less, 4.8. And was the avatar human-like? Only 3.2. That is slightly puzzling because the avatars were actually humans in disguise, but they were rated as not very human-like, and that was presumably the result of the delay in the responses and the glitches and that kind of thing. But level of interest was encouraging. And looking through the questionnaires, these a few things I picked out. Most of them said the experience was better than they had expected. Mm-hmm. Most said they would be happy to have a long-term relationship with the system. As Roberta's indicated, they generally seem to like their interaction with the system and to be sorry that it was coming to an end. And perhaps even more surprising, several said that they would accept it as a priest or confessor. As they were all Catholics, I found that really quite surprising, and that's quite a tribute, I think, to what was achieved by these wizards in the interaction. So coming on to the GPT-3 research, I mean, not exactly GPT-3, but that kind of open AI system. We got questionnaires back from 13 of the users. They were Facebook friends of Yorick. They're probably not a representative sample of the population. I assume they're not, but probably had a particular interest in this kind of thing. That's what you would expect. And they were variable in religiousness. I mean, there were a couple of questions in the questionnaires about their religiousness, and they seem to me to break down sort of fairly into three roughly equal groups. Some were sort of conventionally religious, believed in God, went to church. Some were clearly atheist, but there was also an in-between group that were probably SBNR, the acronym for spiritual but not religious. They sort of do you believe in God in a way, or believe there is sort of something beyond myself? Various kind of qualified religious positions, neither fully conventionally religious nor atheist, but somewhere in between. So we had a spread of religiousness and spirituality in these people. Level of interest was also good, actually just fractionally higher than in the Wizard research. Benefit was lower, and I think that's a reflection of what they actually experienced. I mean, it's partly a difference in religiousness, that some of these people were atheists and weren't expecting on those grounds to get any benefit from spiritual conversation. But I think those low benefit scores were also partly a reflection of the limitations of the system. And were they human-like? Generally, they were quite positive ratings. It's curious that the wizards who were actually human were rated as not very human-like, and OpenAI was rated as more. So, that's partly, I think, because of the more normal kind of speed and pattern of interaction. But there are some interesting qualifications in that comment. You've heard the snippet from Roberta about conversation. This seems to me one of the more impressive responses that I saw. How can we be more spiritual in our own lives? To be more spiritual in your own life, try to focus on developing a deeper connection with yourself and the divine. Spend time in nature or meditating to reflect on your inner self and find peace and harmony. Cultivate a sense of gratitude and appreciation for the beauty and joy in life, and practice acts of kindness and compassion for others. If I'd been asked that question, I don't think I could have put it better, really. That seems to me a pretty good response. Comments on the system. Each answer on its own was very human-like, 9 or 10. But after a few answers, the style of answer became so repetitive that if I'd been a judge, I think they meant a Leubner judge, I would have said it was a bot. So I think that's an interesting comment. I assume that the wizards have a template for the kind of responses that they should use. And every time they're asked a question, they use the same template, and the template becomes repetitive. And I think that's really a problem, that humans are able to kind of vary the template of their answers in a way that at present the system isn't. And another somewhat similar comment, I find it difficult to get into a more conversational style and felt very much like I was just looking something up. Another comment, this system would have to be vastly improved for human use. There was no real discussion. no probing of my beliefs. I was interested in the snippet from the wizard research that Roberta gave us. One of the things I liked about the wizards is that they did probe and ask questions. I think OpenAI didn't. No probing of my beliefs, no asking why, no showing of any real interest in my individual responses, and no challenge to expand upon my beliefs or explore other points of view. Without a meaningful and engaging discussion, why would a person want to use this program? So significant limitations, I think, superficially convincing if you just have one or two exchanges, one or two questions and answers, reasonably convincing, but over a period of time, it became less convincing. There was another person who commented that they found that someone who'd had more than one session, that they were more dissatisfied in the second session than they had been at the first. But it seems there's some value, even at this level, even where we are in automated spiritual conversation. And this raises questions of sort of when to go to a computer and when to go to a human. And I think from this research, we're starting to get some answers to that. Advantages of computers. One is they're readily available. If you had this on your phone, it could be available anytime. And confidentiality. You can say things to a computer and they go no further, or at least in principle, that ought to be achievable. You're not sort of telling another human being. And computers are a good source of information. People commented that it's like looking things up. It's like an automated encyclopedia that you can quickly and easily get very good expert information about things. And I think computers are also good at facilitating self-exploration. And that goes back to the Weizenbaum work. Giving advice is another thing, but a lot of people use spiritual conversation just to facilitate self-exploration. And I think computers are capable of doing that quite well. The advantages of humans. I think when people have conversation in general, and particularly spiritual conversation, they're looking for a feeling of being understood. And it seems to me that's difficult for a computer to provide. Maybe that will come when the systems have been developed further, but I think it's one of the more difficult things for a computer to provide. People are also looking for a sense of support and connection with another person. And my hunch is, this is something you could investigate empirically, but it hasn't been yet. My sense is that you get that much more with another human being in the same room. And then you get various sort of physiological indicators of connections, sometimes synchronization of heart rate and that kind of thing. You don't get any of that, I think, when you're interacting with a computer. And as I said, people commented on the computer's inability to probe. Maybe that could improve, but if at the moment, if you want a spiritual conversation where you will be probed, you need to go for a human for that. And if you want personalized advice, trustworthy advice and wisdom, then you're probably better off going to a human for that at the moment. Some of those disadvantages of computer systems may be overcome, but some I think will be quite difficult to overcome. But already, despite those limitations, I think there are significant uses for the kind of computer system we were investigating, and that came out of the questionnaire data. Thank you. So now it's over to Greg to talk about the linguistic data.
Okay, so the my task was to find out what we could do with the textual data that came from these sessions. And the question was how to find out how people, well, just sort of statistics about the session, whether people stuck, whether sessions were sticky or not, and what they were talking about during these sessions. So that's what I tried to explore. So as we've seen, there are two types of sessions. One were Wizard of Oz sessions with a human, and the other ones were a dialogue with the OpenAI advanced language model. So this is part of the data. Another data I used is a list of 500 human values from this website. And these are values like caring, celebration, celebrity, chance, change. And the other data I used was a word embedding built by Google over their news database, about 10 billion words. And in the word embedding space, every word is embedded in a 300-dimensional space. And the way that it's built, the words that have some sort of semantic connection are close together in the space. So those were the three things I tried to combine. If you just look at the data of the exchanges, there were, I copied and pasted this on. There were 9, I count the number of exchanges between the user and the wizard. In the first case, where we had open a Wizard of Oz experiment, and there were between 9 and 68, and that, I'm sorry, this data isn't right. And the number of exchanges when the OpenAI cases were smaller, people didn't talk as long. And when the wizard was a human, people gave up to 68 exchanges where the user said something and the wizard responded. But there were much less of that in the OpenAI case. The average number of exchanges when in the first column was the Wizard of Oz was 35 statement responses for each session. And the average number was, I guess it was about the same, 33 statement responses per session when it was the OpenAI. Mm-hmm. But one difference is that with the human, people spoke, and I only counted the words that were spoken by the human, between 600 and 7,000 words during one session, with an average of 2,700 words being spoken. So people were engaged in it. In the OpenAI session, the average was 800 words. The maximum was 800 words, and the average was 300 words. So the sessions might have had about the same number of statements, but people were using less words when they were talking with the real AI. In the case of the human Wizard of Oz case, people spoke more words in the last 2/3 of the session than in the first third, as if they were sort of getting into it, and they would have more exchanges. This didn't show up as much in the AI case. There were slightly longer exchanges as the session went on, but then it sort of dropped off in the final third. So it seemed people were more interested in talking with a real human. It's one thing we can just determine from that. Now, to get back to the data and what we can do automatically, I took each one of those 500 human value words and took its point in the embedded space. And then I mapped every word in the session to the closest human value. And then I calculated the frequencies of the human values in the beginning, middle, and end of the session. And here's an example. Before the example, so I said Google embedding, each word is a point in a 300-dimensional space. And so every word that the person uttered, removing all the stop words, was mapped to the closest human value. For example, the word speaking was closest in the word to the X space, in the embedded space, to listening, which is one of the 500 human values. And each word had a certain distance. So for each of the transcribed sessions, so the 22 from the first phase and 34 from the second phase, I removed all the lines automatically identified as wizard utterances. I split into words and removed all the stop words and mapped the remaining words into the nearest human value from the embedded space. So for example, in the sentence, and you know that I have said that I have found lockdown more spiritually challenging and more spiritually interesting than difficult or unpleasant and damaging in the way to my faith. So after the first steps, the empty words are removed, and we have things like lockdown, spiritually challenging, spiritually interesting, difficult, unpleasant, and risk. And below in uppercase letters, you find the human values those words are mapped closest to. So once we have this reduced set of words, we can calculate which of the human values come up most in all the sessions. And the most common human values had to do with community. And in italic after the word community, you see a number of the words that were mapped to community. So there's things like people, country, public, community, buildings, family, population. Those are all mapped to community. And so there are 484 words that appeared in all the dialogues having to do with community. And then communion maps all the words in parentheses. There's some examples of the words that map to communion, was the second most common human value. And then listening and reality and family and spirituality and understanding. So it seems the topics chosen were very personal and often related to the spiritual or the family or the community, which makes sense, especially in the second case where the AI was tasked with presenting a spiritual point of view of things. But in effect, there was actually no great difference in the values between the first phase and the second phase in terms of these words were used by the users themselves. So I had statistics for the first phase and second phase, and they're about the same proportion of the same word, of the same values. If we divide the sessions up into thirds, we can calculate which topics were more discussed at the beginning and which topics were more discussed in the middle and more discussed in the end. And we find that the human values related to problems, which were things like problems matter, issues, difficulties, troubles, were broached more in the final third of the sessions than in the beginning and the middle. So this is something that naturally occurs anyway. When people talk, it's toward the end of the session where they start talking about the real problems. In the beginning, people talked about spirituality, adversity, change, and health, and gradually abandoned these somewhat descriptive topics as they progressed into more personal areas. So there's not much data to work with, but we can say that people spoke longer and longer sentences as the sessions went on, which demonstrated at least an engagement with the spiritual companion. And the topics generally touched upon globally about spiritual, family, and community, and became a little bit more personal toward the end of the session. And that's what I could find from that data. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. So that's the end of our presentations, but now we move towards discussion. And before we get into general discussion, I'm going to ask William Clarkson, who's a project member, to open up the discussion with any comments he'd like to make.
Hello, and thank you very much, Fraser. Also, thank you to the speakers, and I have to say, particularly, it's good to see Roberta on Zoom again. So it's good to see you. Now, I made a few notes about things that occurred to me during the the meeting. And first, I liked the fact that Roberta picked up the point that interacting with the wizard over multiple sessions underscores the importance of having a user model. And I don't mean having a model that dialogue systems sometimes have, which is of users in general, but a personalized model that relates to an individual user and which is derived from multiple conversations with that user. And this also connects with Fraser's point about users needing personalized advice. And so, you know, a personalized user model would be needed to facilitate that. And also it connects with Greg's conclusions about how the dialogue proceeded over time. Things that as the dialogue progressed, the conversation became more personal, etc. And those are key ingredients to take account of if you want to design a personalized user model. I was interested in the fact that users wanted an avatar that actively drives the dialogue forward. And I think this is a kind of an expectation from the best type of spiritual director who will push back a little and challenge in a gentle or appropriate way. When I was a wizard in the part 1, I was more non-directive, and I didn't want to say anything that might betray my humanness, such as it is. Also, when I needed a few moments to collect my thoughts during the session, I said, "One moment, please, let me think about this." Now, that's something that I hope a computer would say if it has to go away and do a bit more processing, but it's not something that happens in a human conversation. Human conversation will fill in, you know, with some more improvisation and stuff like that, and or maybe elicit more response from the user. And I didn't want to do that. I actually wanted to collect my thoughts and think about what a good answer would be. And so I said, you know, let me think about this for, you know, okay. Now, and so that probably wouldn't happen in a real conversation. And so I'm probably one of the wizards who scored very low on the human dimension. I also became aware that the user that I was given had some serious personal issues. And I didn't want to get drawn in on those to discuss them in depth, as the user would eventually find out that they weren't talking to a machine after all. And so I needed to preserve a little bit of the illusion for the sake of the sensitivity of the user. I'm not surprised by the user reaction to the phase 2 wizard, the large language model. The phase 2 wizard seems to be very didactic in the way that it responds to the user, and not at all characteristic of a real spiritual conversation. And that's not surprising. GPT summarizes material from the internet. That's all it does. And somebody wrote that, or wrote the base material, if you like, that Fraser quoted as the ChatGPT response, a very good one, as we agree, to the spiritual direction question. Somebody wrote that. It's on the internet, and you can Google for it. Now, it may not be exactly as it was written for the internet, and that's the whole point of GPT, that it is able to provide a statistically likely summary of what it finds. But people wrote that. So don't consider that to be some kind of AI thinking of the right thing de novo to say in response to that question. Okay, so those are the main points that I wanted to make from this, and I'd be very happy to hear from others, starting perhaps with those who have not yet spoken.
Thanks very much. So open floor now. Who'd like to come in?
Yeah,
Hello, John.
I just
Good to
want
see
to
you.
ask a question.
Of course.
The avatar is a visual representation of a person with emotional expressions are somehow varied in some way. Is that right? But it's not an expression that matches the conversational context. And when you hear a real human express, like William, express their opinion and respond to a user with real emotion, and then you see this face, and this is really what I think you should do in the next moment of your life. It's the expression on the face that's the expression that seems to come across, as opposed to the emotion that's being actually expressed. The mismatch is the reason, it seems to me, why the avatar doesn't get a high human rating. It doesn't get a high human rating, not because of the auditory input, the verbal input, although there can be some control over that, and that's maybe part of the reason. It's the mismatch between the facial expressions and emotion as expressed by the face and the verbal communications. If you just use auditory, I'll bet you the human would beat out the machine any day of the week, because the machine sounds like an automaton and a human doesn't sound like an automaton. I just thought that needed to be put out.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's also one of the lessons from research in Android science about the appearance of androids and what difference that makes to affect and response in people. But really, I think this is something Roberto is probably best able to handle. I'd be interested to hear from Marius on this, because it was actually Marius was the model for this, and you know what? That's really how he speaks now.
I like your
yeah, very good point. We used an off-the-shelf site palette, it's called free system, so it's very basic. I think that there are much better versions of that, and that is a research topic all its own that people are working on. So I think you can get much better versions, but we didn't really have access to them. But yeah, I agree. If somebody says some pleasantry and looks dire, yeah, it's going to throw everyone off, isn't it? Yeah.
In the questionnaires, we had quite a few comments about the avatar. So a number of people wanted to be able to choose their own avatar, and also quite a lot of comments about the background. People wanted to be able to choose the background for their avatar. So what things looked like on the screen seemed to make quite a difference to people.
And I thought it was interesting that at least one user wondered about a gendered avatar.
I'd like to make a comment that I've been using, since it came out in December, I've been using ChatGPT a lot. And I think it's a marvelous tool. And one of the things you can do is ask it to express things in a certain way. It'd be interesting to take the criticisms of our current system and say, be a personality that is more probing and that shows more interest in people's responses. And I'm going to try that afterwards and see what that gives as answers. So it's possible that the personality can be engineered that way.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to remember about GPT is that it's a large language model plus some protocols that have been created by hand by OpenAI employees. So, and that makes a difference as well. For example, if you ask it to make a poem, it'll rhyme. poems don't have to rhyme, but the ones that GPT-3 does do. Yeah, I've used it a couple of times. So in one of the gigs I do as a jazz guitarist, we were going to perform Little Wing by Jimi Hendrix, and it only has 2 verses. And I thought, okay, let's see if ChatGPT can make up more. And it gave me, so I asked it for more verses to Little Wing in the style of Jimi Hendrix, and it did, and it gave me 10 pretty good verses. Now, this was a gig to be played at a sailing club. So then I said, put in some sailing content, and it did. You know, those that mentioned a yacht and the wind and this sort of thing. So yeah, that was nice. But then I gave it a slightly more challenging question, which doesn't seem challenging on the outset, on the surface. Where I live, we go through gluts of vegetables and fruit because they grow, and we had a glut of cherry tomatoes. And so I said to ChatGPT, what can I do with cherry tomatoes? And I phrased that very carefully. What can I do with cherry tomatoes? It gave me 10 recipes that it found on the internet, of course. I didn't ask for recipes. I said, what can I do with cherry tomatoes? Okay, so it's going to assume I did recipes made because that's what is available on the internet. Had it been a real lateral thinker, it could have said all sorts of things. You know, you can put them between your toes when you have a manicure, you know. I mean, I don't do that, but I know that people do. Not cherry tomatoes, but, you know. You can do all sorts of things with. You can stick them on your nose, you can squash them underfoot, you can throw them. You know, there's all sorts of things you can do with cherry tomatoes, but Chat had no idea of that type of thing. So that's when my serious disenchantment started to set in.
Well, there's lots of reasons to. I mean, when you probe, you find that it does some things amazingly and some things stupidly. But that reminds me, there's one other aspect of it that could help us. It stores your dialogue, and you can go back to some chat that you had with it, and it has a context there. And the context is only 4,000 words. But still, it has the idea that you can take up a session where you left it off. And that's one of the criticisms we had in our version of it.
Just a response to William. I mean, I don't think that's such a silly answer because, I mean, what do people mostly do with cherry tomatoes? They cook with them, they eat them. I mean, yeah, you can put them between your toes, you can put them in your ears. Unusual. So I'm surprised you didn't say, what are the unusual things you can do with cherry tomatoes? But if you ask somebody at a party, what do you do with cherry tomatoes? They're likely to give you a recipe or two, aren't they?
I have a question about Greg's data. There are 2 parts of the data, aren't there, Greg? There's the part about number of words and so on, and there's the other part about topics. And in the first part, number of words, you presented an interesting contrast between the wizards and the OpenAI. But with the second part of the research on topics, I think there wasn't really a contrast. I think you got basically the same pattern from wizards and OpenAI. And it's surprising in a way that, if I've got that right, that there was a difference in one set of data, but not in the other. Any comments about that?
Well, the difference was in the length of the exchanges, and that was one of the differences. But when I looked at the content, I made statistics for each of the content, and it didn't jump at me as saying this is completely different. So it seemed like people were still doing the same type of dialogues in both systems.
Only more briefly, if they were talking with an OpenAI.
Yeah, they're more brief. That's the only difference.
Yeah.
Can I say we find the same in student essays as well? So all the essays that I have put through software to try and find out if they were written by ChatGPT have all shown shorter sentence structures than the student has used on average in all their other previous essays.
Ah, clever.
Which is interesting. Could I just share some of my reflections for discussion? Because as I'm listening, I'm a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist. So as I'm listening, it was particularly as John commented, as I heard the voice of the AI, I was really struck by how different it was to a human voice, and particularly really thinking around issues of embodiment when you look at sort of research on psychotherapy, but I think this applies to spiritual direction as well. I think firstly, there's a way in which human beings use their voices in order to prime the attachment systems of others, to know that there is a person present. So it's not just the content of what we say or the length of it, it's the sort of intonation. And then the second thing that sort of struck me as well is when you look at sort of research on transcripts of therapy, some people would argue that you can tell who's going to do well in psychotherapy purely by looking at not what they say, but how they say it, that there's a sort of pausing and there's a checking in with their embodiment as they go, checking in with their felt sense of what things are. And some people say that that's absolutely essential to a shifting, that those sort of somatic markers are really essential, because we're trying to very vaguely find our way to hit on the right words. And when we finally find them, they have a huge effect on us. I'm just wondering how that fits with a sort of AI model of spiritual companionship, really. Is there room for that? Maybe there's notions of embodied cognition or other things that would come into play. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. I'm speaking from my field of expertise to a field of expertise I know little about, but very interested in.
Well, may I jump in? I think there's plenty of room for that. It's absolutely essential. I think that any system needs to perform as a person and to understand how people perform when they do these embodied somatic information. It is information, and I think it would be essential for a system to make use of that and to be able to perform it as well. Yeah, I've got a comment about the basic human value things for Greg, but I'm willing to give way to anyone else who wants to respond to Roger's point.
Hi. Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, that really was, yeah, interesting to hear. And I did notice in the sessions that they sometimes seemed more like therapy sessions than spiritual advice sessions. And so that, makes me wonder, they're naturally close, I guess, these two sorts of things. So if we're going to build a spiritual advisor, we need to look carefully at how it's different from therapy. And interesting to hear how word choice and timing and all of that makes a huge difference in therapy. And I guess maybe that's true in general in conversation. Maybe, can we draw that conclusion? Yeah. So no, that's.
I think it has something to do with authenticity, which is important in normal human interaction as well as therapy.
Yeah. What do people think about the relationship between therapy and spiritual advice? Do priests and vicars, are they often in a situation of doing more therapy sessions? Or does anyone know?
Yes, and there's been a shift in sort of spiritual direction style over the decades, I think, really, and moving towards exploring what the issues are before you sort of wade in and give advice or hear a confession. There's probably a slight difference in practice here between the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, certainly about confessions. Catholic confessions are still quite often, I think, just hearing a confession and in a fairly sort of stereotype kind of way. But most Anglican priests, I think, if asked to hear a confession, would want to have a chat with the person first and understand what they were dealing with before they went sacramental and heard the confession and pronounced absolution. So I think there's been a significant shift in that direction gradually since the middle of the 20th century, I would say.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I would kind of emphasize that even more in my ministry in the Church of England. There's not a lot of call for the formal sacrament of reconciliation, but there is a lot of chat which might otherwise be used in that context, but it takes place, you know, in a quiet corner somewhere, or even, you know, somewhere where there are other people about but not listening, and it has many of the characteristics of sacrament of reconciliation, but maybe without the formal trappings, if you see what I mean.
I mean, I think it's particularly powerful to have both, actually, to start with chat and then to move into prayer or sacrament after that, which kind of consolidates what has been said in chat in a different kind of way and considerably enhances the impact and transformational power of it. So, I mean, there's been a bit of discussion of this in pastoral psychology literature, but my sense is the combination is particularly powerful.
Yeah, I agree.
So after that, perhaps, William, we can come to your question to Greg, or your comments about the semantic analysis.
Right. I liked using the list of basic human values as the keywords for the word analysis, and it was interesting that you started with the 500 that one can find online. That was interesting. I'd be curious to know what would happen if you started, instead with 500, you used Shalom Schwartz's 10 values. He has 10 basic values, which over research over decades, he and his colleagues have sort of distilled down a kind of a cross-cultural analysis of lots and lots of value words, but he's boiled it down to 10. And it would seem to me that there might be stronger correlations with a smaller set of values because there's less to choose from. And so it's kind of, if you're using a winner takes all updating strategy, it might be easier to implement.
Yeah, you mentioned that last time, and I did try that. So I took those 10 values and tried to find their points in the embedded space, and it didn't give results. One reason is that words can be very far away to the nearest one of those 10 values. And so it'd be much more complicated to eliminate the words that didn't connect up with the real value. And I wasn't able to get any results that looked meaningful to it.
Yeah, and I think that's probably methodological because these 10 names that he gives are sort of
there's power, achievement, hedonism.
Yeah, that's right. But each of those 10 names is stands for a cluster of related names, and those, I guess, come from the 500. And so I guess that's right, that you would be looking for words that appear in the clusters from which those 10 names stand for, rather than the 10 names themselves. So yeah, I guess that would be right. The 10 names themselves might not be as meaningful in the semantic space.
And I think he even tried to take those 10 categories like power and hedonism and then associate a number of words to them and then take the average of that point as a point in space. But I didn't get results that looked interesting.
Yeah. It might require massive amounts of data to do that.
That's true.
Greg, while we're throwing possible schemes at you, have you done anything with the VIA inventory of strengths, which is the other place I would go for value words or positive qualities, if you like?
No, I didn't.
No.
But I could try that.
Yeah, it's one of the areas that I've done a lot of work in, and I've found almost there's barely a subject under the sun that I can't attach somewhere somehow to that, those sort of 24. And also the way they were put together is that they increased as many synonyms as they possibly could for all 24 of the strengths, which then again, it means that every single strength is actually a world of its own, really, on some level. But yeah,
send me a pointer to that, please, and I'll look at it.
Just if Schwartz comes up, I always think that Peterson and Seligman should get a mention as well.
Is that the VIA inventory, Roger, that you're talking about?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Values in action inventory, I think it's called.
No, it's what they call an orphaned acronym. It used to be called Values in Action, but they now just call it VIA, and they've forgotten it was ever called anything to do with values.
Right.
I think because they changed the philosophy behind it ultimately.
Yeah.
We're perhaps moving towards the end of our discussion. We've allowed quite a chunk of time, but it's up to us how far we want to go with it. There is plenty of time if there are more questions that people want to raise, but also we can draw things to a close. John, do you want to come in? Good.
Well, about the future, it seems to me that the recent developments in the chat thing is that you can correlate pictures with words, and you can use the picture. Well, at least you can do pictures, and you can do words. And if you had correlated pictures with words, and you had, for instance, something like the wizard setup, where you actually had a communication with a human, and you actually had facial gestures of that human interacting with you, and you collected that as the database on which to develop a version of the AI program that would use maybe none of the background information of OpenAI, but a whole bunch of therapy sessions that had actually, not therapy sessions, spiritual sessions. I'm a psychologist. I did conflate those two terms. Spiritual sessions with real actors. I wondered if that way of training the AI system could possibly affect the creating of avatars, synthesizing avatars that actually had facial expressions from a particular act to begin with, but those expressions that correlate with the emotions being expressed in a language, the way that kind of language is used in the spiritual intelligence activity of the actual wizard spiritual leaders. I think that would create avatars that are much more convincing than the kind of setups that you have a visual avatar that doesn't have any expression that correlates with the emotions being expressed in the language of a real speaker, and you could replace the kind of boring language of current AI people with that. Now that may be a grand program. I'm sure William is happy to take that up any minute now.
Well, if I was supervising research students, I would put one on it straight away.
Great.
But I'm no longer supervising research students or anything else for that matter.
Roberta.
I was thinking on that topic. I mean, we could look to the movie makers, especially the animation people. I mean, surely they've done all of this sort of thing already. They must have, loads and loads of expressions, tied up with word meaning. I would imagine. I don't know, but just saying, they get a script and they're going to animate it. So how's that person going to look?
Yeah, this is what directors do.
Exactly. Do we know any people in Hollywood that would be interested? I mean, yeah. Anyway.
I'm sure this is something that can be improved in the years to come.
Yeah.
And the look and expression of the avatar, I think, can definitely be improved. Marius, you're going to come in.
Speaking of the look and the expression of the avatar, yeah. Well, if I were to draw things more into a theological area, I was reminded by very recently, serendipitously, by something that Rowan Williams said, that God is the presence in which it doesn't make sense not to be truthful. And to a certain extent, that could be expanded to spiritual companions or spiritual gurus or priests as well. So they become a presence in which people don't feel the need to hide anymore. And to be truthful, well, of course, in a very pragmatic sense, but also in a more metaphysical sense, truthful to themselves and so on. And I wonder what would it take for AI to become that? And I don't know if personhood is necessary a criterion here. I wonder whether there are ways for AI to become that without becoming human-like, but still becoming the kind of presence that requires or imposes or incentivizes one to be truthful in that sense. And if they did that, perhaps that could be well enough, at least from the part of helping you to explore oneself. The part about spiritual advice is quite a different thing. But yeah, I don't even know where would I start approaching that question. But perhaps William has some idea. I'm just guessing.
Yes, it's about creating a category, something like personhood, except not necessarily with all the metaphysical implications that people sometimes attribute to personhood, but would contain important concepts, as you mentioned, truth-telling, and there could be other ones, certain type. Yeah, I think there's something in that.
Mm-hmm.
Fraser, before you close, would it be possible were you thinking of putting in a plug for the next meeting?
Yes, I was. Before I do that, shall I just see if anyone else has got comments about this session? More comments?
Yeah.
Roberta.
Yeah, I just thinking about this point of, I think Marius triggered it, of speaking to somebody who you kind of feel, not know, but that you feel is really listening to you and is well disposed to whatever it is you're going to tell them. I mean, what about all of these situations where you'll meet a stranger, say on a train, and all of a sudden they'll tell you some dark secret, and you're kind of like, and they may not have ever told anybody before. You occasionally, has anybody else had this experience where, somebody will say, they'll be like, well, I've never actually told anybody this, but blah. And all of a sudden you've got this, whatever it is. So I really believe there's some mileage in this stuff both ways. I mean, whether or not it's somebody, that almost people aren't even really why they do it. They're not, they don't look at you. They don't know you at all. You're just a stranger on a train. But so it's something, it comes from them more than some relationship even. Anyway, I think, people do want to talk into the abyss sometimes, just to relieve themselves of the burden of situations that weigh them down.
Yeah, Roberta, that phenomenon about, a stranger striking up a very personal and deep conversation with you has a name. And in the neurodivergence community, it's called oversharing.
Oh, okay. Okay. I see. Yeah. Okay. But people seem to do it and want to do it. So, I mean, there may be something here. I mean, along those lines as well.
I do. My observation would be that does happen to some people more than to others, though, Roberta. So I do know friends who it seems to be a regular occurrence for them, and other people who I'm pretty sure it never ever happens to.
Oh, really?
And,
okay.
so I do think, again, we're sort of thinking a little bit about embodiment and how physiology communicates, or sort of readiness or openness or trustworthiness and so, or non-threateningness. I don't know what the signals would be, but I think there is more to the relationship in that sort of context than you perhaps. It's happening to you a lot, Roberta. There's obviously something about you that makes people think they can share things with you.
Oh, all right. Better examine myself then.
I wouldn't worry about it.
I view it positively.
Okay.
I think individual differences come into this as well, and the most of people who want to share in this way, there are some who would rather do it with a human being and some who would rather do it with a computer. And I think the study of individual differences is one of the things for the future in this area. So I think we're at the end of this discussion. I'm going to bring it to a close now. Thank you for being here. And I believe a lot of people will benefit from watching this on YouTube.
Thank you for joining us. Please watch the ISSR YouTube channel and podcast for the next 2 episodes and future episodes of ISSR's In Conversation and other special content related to the field of science and religion. If you enjoyed what you have seen and or heard here today, please consider clicking the like button and subscribing, and let us know what discussions you would like to see in the future in the comment section below. Make sure to see the rest of the content we have posted on our channels and on our website for more academic discussions and content related to the field of science and religion. Bye for now, and see you at the next ISSR In Conversation.